Welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. This week, I'm happy to welcome back Stephen Semler, who is co-founder of the Security Policy Reform Institute. He also writes the Polygraph newsletter on Substack. He just published a true deep dive on responsible statecraft entitled Gaza Breakdown, 20 Times Israel Used U.S. Arms and Likely War Crimes. I want everyone to read it, and I thought it would be helpful to have him come on the podcast and explain all of the data in the piece and what we need to take away from it. So thanks, Stephen, for joining us.
It's good to be back. I'm happy to be a friend of the show now.
Absolutely. A great friend of the show. In your piece, Stephen, you point out that the Biden administration had already greenlit more than 100 separate weapons deals for Israel, or about one every 36 hours on average since the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel. The total value is vague because the administration approved them at levels that are under the threshold price tag for which Congress and therefore the public has to be notified. But we know that, according to the Israeli Defense Ministry this week, that 500 support or transport planes and 107 ships have delivered more than 50,000 tons of weapons and military equipment from the U.S. to Israel since the war started in Gaza. This would include U.S.-made aircraft like the F-35, F-16, and F-15 to drop U.S.-made bombs, including the Mk-84, Mk-83, and Mk-82, which are 2,000 pounds, 1,000 pounds, and 500 pounds, respectively, and 250-pound small diameter bombs, which can be fitted with U.S.-made Joint Direct Attack Munition, or JDAM, guidance kits. It also includes armored vehicles and fuel for all the planes. But your goal with this article was not so much to create a laundry list of all the weapons, but how they're being used in the war, and to tie specific incidents in which likely war crimes were committed against Palestinians since October 7th with U.S. weaponry. So can you tell us a little bit about what you found and what are some of the most salient points that you'd like to get across to the audience today?
Sure. I found, after reviewing, probably hundreds of possible violations committed with U.S. weapons, I decided to narrow down the scope to just weapons that we knew were sent to Israel after October 7th and war crimes that were also committed after October 7th. So the threshold was high to make this list, and the fact that I still wound up with 20 is at once nowhere near like an insultingly small number, but at the same time a mind-blowing amount considering the lack of information that the Biden administration shares. It's almost like we know more about what weapons Israel's received from Israel because they keep publicizing the stuff that gets on the ground. Right. And also, Israeli officials are more open about how much they rely on these munitions to keep their campaign going, while meanwhile in Washington, there are people who actually believe and say that it wouldn't really matter if the U.S. cut off arms, but that's clearly not the case. I think that's probably the general point that I got from this analysis is that, it was known already, but just how much the Israelis rely on U.S. munitions, and not just rely on it, but how much the manner in which the U.S. supplies them, which is just, unconditional aid and basically a nonstop torrent of U.S. arms. So you mentioned the 100 plus arms sales. In part of that is strategic, as you mentioned, to keep it below threshold. I think it's for Israel, it's like $100 or $150 million value. But at the same time, it's also because Israel actually needs that many arms shipments that frequently to sustain its campaign. So that was one thing, but it also shapes Israeli behavior. Like the quote from the former high-ranking Israeli military official who said that Israel could have achieved the same amount of progress it has in Gaza with just 10% of the damage. And the fact that it has fired, I read, as of the spring, I don't think I included this in the report, but it had fired 300,000 munitions in Gaza as of April. And that's because Israeli forces were just so sure that these munitions would be replenished and not be cut off. there is one case which I can get into later that really struck me as sort of defining where the Biden administration is at, is when I was cataloging all these instances before I wheedled them down to the 20. I noticed a lot of potential violations of international law committed with U.S. weapons prior to the start of this year, committed with 2,000-pound bombs, and then beginning early this year, a sudden uptick in the amount of war crimes committed with these smaller, more precise 250-pound bombs. And I noticed this list, and it was such a stark contrast between 2023 and 2024 when it came down to that. And I mentioned this in the piece, but what I found was that the Biden administration had been, like, there's numerous reports of them trying to convince Israeli officials to use 250-pound bombs and wean them off to 2,000-pound bombs. And what happened since then is that Israel has used the smaller bombs, the more precise bombs, to more precisely target civilians.
Right. So
that I think sums up where the Biden administration is at generally with arms transfers to Israel. Just a more PR-friendly string of human rights violations to present to the domestic audience, but making really no difference on the ground.
Yeah, and I'd like to note that that is about the time that some of the stories, the piece or the reporting in the Washington Post taking place in December, where reporters said almost half the munitions in Israel, or that Israel had used in Gaza since the war began, had been unguided bombs that the U.S. had provided, or as we would call them colloquially, dumb bombs. And so I would imagine that was obviously part and parcel of the massive devastation in those first months. It said in this reporting by the Washington Post, so Israel Defense Forces has fired more than 29,000 air-to-ground munitions into the Palestinian enclave since October 7th, and only 55 to 60% of them had been precision guided. This is according to our own Director of National Intelligence, and the rest were known as dumb bombs. So I guess Biden had been reacting to that when he was pushing supposedly for these smaller 250 diameter bombs. But as you mentioned, that they're showing up on the ground in all of these civilian slaughters, and including, tent cities in Rafah that had been reported earlier this summer, which had caused massive fires among civilians there. Can you talk about maybe one or two of the most egregious examples that you came across in this 20 case study that you did, that maybe the American people don't quite know about, that their tax dollars had paid for in this war?
Well, you just brought up the Rafah tent city on May 26th. Israel dropped at least two GBU-39s, which are the 250-pound bombs I was just talking about, on the tent city. And that's what I'm talking about. I mean, the weight of the bomb itself, I mean, I guess it makes somewhat of a difference, but if you're targeting civilians, you're still going to get a massive amount of casualties. Now, this was one of the rare attacks that attracted, U.S. condemnation from the Biden administration itself. Like, it was bad enough, and then Israel offered an excuse, I guess. Their story changed a few times, but ultimately they settled on, there's a weapons stockpile present at this tent city, but there was no evidence before, during, or after that there was any sort of munitions that would have caused as many deaths as there had been. I mean, dozens of deaths, hundreds of injuries as a result of that May 26th attack with the GBU-39. Boeing markets them as precise munitions. John Kirby, a White House spokesperson, describes them as discreet, but they really have an extensive blast radius. Not just with the shockwave, but also they send metal fragments flying that will just rip bodies apart. And I decided during the course of this that one job I don't want is to be a war crimes investigator, because the things that I read were just just unbelievable, scarring, to be honest. So I think that's one where, we're being told that the Israelis are using precise munitions, but again, it just doesn't matter if you're targeting tents in Rafah. Another one this was more general, but in the section on the 2,000-pound bombs, before I list the cases, I just provide a little bit of context. And the one that got me is that the Israeli military designates safe zones for civilians to flee. And an investigation from the New York Times found that on more than 200 occasions, Israel had designated a safe zone, then bombed the safe zone to which it had told civilians to flee. So that was another one. The third one, the last one I'll mention, is just a general thought where the threshold to commit a war crime is extremely high. Like, war is brutal, and you're going to end up with a ton of civilian deaths, even if you go strictly by the book in terms of international law. But when you have, like, in U.S. discourse, especially coming from like Israel lobby-sponsored members of Congress and Senate, like John Fetterman, for example, one of my senators, he acts like war crimes are just sort of an inevitability, and he diminishes the value of them and how serious they are. But again, I mean, you can really cause a lot of carnage, operating strictly within the bounds of international law. But if you're committing likely war crimes, which all of the cases I list are, there's enough evidence from reporting or human rights groups have already determined that they're likely or certainly war crimes. All of the cases are, likely war crimes, which means they're extremely bad. Yeah. Like, they are way, just totally beyond the pale. It's not just some sort of inevitability, like, oh, Hamas uses human shields or Hamas does this. It's really like disproportionate attacks, indiscriminate attacks, or ones that discriminately target civilians. So those are probably the three main takeaways. And I guess, as an added bonus, I would say that I left many out, either because they just weren't close, or I couldn't find a specific munitions fragment to link the case. And then there was also one where the weapon hadn't been shipped yet, but I looked at this case where during the Nusayrat massacre, where Israel managed to rescue 4 of its hostages, it showed video of elite Israeli special forces and police raiding this house, seemingly shooting, raiding this woman's house, shooting her 2 sons, killing one for seemingly no reason, just other than the fact that it was a transfer zone to transfer the hostages from one van to another. And on the ground, during the raid, on the aftermath photograph, was shell casings from 5.56 ammunition, which is the NATO standard round. And I looked at it was like, I think the Israeli elite police unit is called the Yamam or something. And then I looked at the paratrooper unit, and both are assigned M4A1 rifles, which earlier this year, in the spring, in April, Colt Manufacturing was awarded like a $26 million contract to produce and deliver to Israel a few hundred, tens of thousands of these rifles. The same rifles used to murder Shireen Abu Akleh in 2021, I believe. So that's one and the expected delivery date is the end of this month. And I looked at the video too, and it looked like the released by the Israeli military that showed the raid, not the gruesome parts, obviously, but just the cool parts. And it looked like they were carrying M4A1s, but I have a bit of background in forensic evidence, but that isn't my specialty. It's actually tear gas canisters that I can identify well. But that one I was tempted to put on, but it would have just taken too long to find an expert to verify. But that's one I'll probably come back to, considering it's such an egregious act.
So everything but having troops on the ground, the U.S. is in this war. Our weapons, the ammo, the armored vehicles, as you mentioned in the piece, the warplanes, the bombs, the fueling, the intelligence. We've done a show here on Trip the Beltway, fantastic, where we talked about the technology that Palantir is giving and transferring to Israel. Has been very open about their agreements with Israel. We don't know specifically what that software is doing, but they specialize in big data that can be sifted through for intelligence and surveillance. And we know that the Israeli military is using AI surveillance and data to target. So, I mean, we're all over this. Our stamp is all over this. But speaking of stamps, just for the audience, and I hope they will all take the time to read your piece, but your piece is filled with pictures or links to pictures. And they're pictures that are of fragments that show DOD or defense company stamps. Can you talk a little bit about how you piece together the U.S. complicity here and putting us on the ground, or our weapons on the ground in these possible war crimes?
Sure. So the way I organized it is I looked at possible cases where it was suspected that a war crime was committed, either because of the evidence that I saw, or it was usually not me making these determinations. There's already experts who had already commented saying this should be investigated as a war crime. So those were the first cases that I looked at, really. And then I cross-referenced those and there was, again, dozens and dozens and dozens of these sorts of cases. And again, the next step was to cross-reference those cases with instances in which a forensic expert had identified a munitions fragment from a U.S.-made weapon at the scene that would explain the extent of the damage. So that's what I did, really. And there's these people out there they're really remarkable. And one dude, Trevor Ball, is a former EOD tech who I think maybe was in Iraq and Afghanistan or whatever. So he has a really extensive knowledge on just a kind of like a Rain Man-esque ability to identify a munitions fragment on the ground. And then based on, there's always codes on it. So in that code, it identifies, not exactly the type of munition, but the subtype, where it's stored, sometimes its contents. So on a 155 millimeter artillery shell, you'll see a designation for a white phosphorus round on that. But you get, what are these called? They're called cage codes, where DOD just tells you the type, so the subtype of munition, sometimes where it's produced. There's just a lot of information you can get from the serial number, basically. So that's what I did in those cases and sometimes, it's hard because these things are designed to blow up. So it's not exactly, it's hard to actually find a munition fragment that there's enough information there because of the distinctive shape or the code is available to put a U.S. weapon there at the time and place of the possible war crime. So again, it's just a really high standard. And these forensic investigations, they're really hard to do anyway. I mean, they take a lot of time, and that's aside from the part of the war crime investigation, which also takes an extremely long time. So,
yeah,
again, just to find 20 of these cases was just incredible to me, just because of how difficult these investigations are, and again, just the lack of transparency.
There'll be plenty of people, maybe not listening to this show, but out there who would say, hey, I'm glad that the United States is giving Israel all of these weapons to go after Hamas. It's obviously we're giving them all the weapons, but this isn't a story about the weapons. Again, this is a story about how they've been used. And what's bothered me from the beginning is that we spent almost 2 years listening to John Kirby, who's the spokesman for the National Security Council, briefing reporters and almost in tears talking about Russian war crimes in Israel. So almost to the minute that a missile strikes a building, a playground, a factory or whatever, the United States representatives, their spokespersons have been out there calling these things war crimes. If people are dead, civilians have been injured, we look at Bucha and what happened there and the deaths and the mysteries surrounding it. But our officials were out there right away blaming the Russians and cheering on charges against them at the International Criminal Court of Justice. But when asked about the potential war crimes in Israel from the start, they have gone out there and said things like, well, we are letting the Israelis investigate. We will comment on this when we find the results of that investigation. We have not seen any evidence. I've actually heard, I believe it was Jake Sullivan saying something to the effect of, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't tell you what is and what is not a war crime. And down the line, after the same people were very vociferous about Russian war crimes. And to this day, you'll see airstrikes in Ukraine, and our people will be out there, the media will be out there and just saying Russia did it, Russia committed it. And they don't have the same sort of like ability to connect. And I think that's because they know that because of our weapons being used the way they are, that if they do acknowledge that these are war crimes, that will trigger actual legal, or it should, legal action by Congress to stop sending the weapons. So what they're doing is just denying that any of this is happening, which means that it can go on forever if Benjamin Netanyahu wants.
Right. And you're exactly right. The U.S. is really quick to designate war crimes when it wants to. As you mentioned, Russia and Ukraine, even when I was working in the humanitarian sector, I saw it a lot with Syria. And they were right pretty much every time. Bashar al-Assad is a mass murderer. When he bombs hospitals, it's pretty clear it's a war crime. But for this, again, it's just, we don't have enough information. How? And the thing is that at one point, like during this project, I kind of forgot what I was doing. I ended up reading just a lot of just Arms Export Control Act, Foreign Assistance Act, the Section 620M of the Foreign Assistance Act, which is the Leahy laws, 620I, which is the blocking of humanitarian aid, which I didn't even get into in the piece. But one thing that stood out to me is that the evidence doesn't have to come in order for Washington to make a determination of whether U.S. munitions were used in war crimes or whether war crimes were committed, or if there's enough human rights violations committed to cut off military aid. It doesn't have to come from a government. I mean, they can make that assessment based on NGO reports. They can use the article we worked on together as reasonable grounds to do it. So I don't mean to sound cynical here. I just don't think that there's nothing that indicates to me that the Biden administration is interested in following domestic or international law when it comes to its Israel policy. I think it decided early on that its policy was going to be no way constrained by human rights law, domestic or international, that it was just going to do its own thing, which I think is extremely destructive, because if you neglect these laws that govern military aid in one context, you're ultimately degrading their effectiveness in other.
Right.
Because you're no longer treating the law as law, you're just basically creating jurisprudence based on convenience and exception, which is totally not the purpose of the law. So the cynical part of me says that there's going to be no legal ramifications domestically, which I think that's why the Biden administration responded so severely and harshly as it did to the ICC decision to issue arrest warrants, because I mean, the U.S. concluded that like Charles Taylor like aided and abetted war crimes by providing arms. So I think that's really the main legal threat coming. It's not going to come from the United States. If there's going to be legal repercussions, it's going to come internationally. So I think that's why there's such a swift discrediting of the ICC, even though, as you mentioned, you know, a few months earlier, they're cheering on them for issuing arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and presumably other Russian officials as well. So I think, like, you know, in the near term, I think there's value in providing a legal case, because I could be wrong here about the legal instruments coming from, you know, if they're used, I think it'll be because it'll be a political decision to use these legal instruments, to invoke this evidence, to use it essentially as an excuse, which I think is how all members of Congress and elected officials should act, really. Like, no matter, it shouldn't really matter how they feel about Israel or whatever. It's just they're supposed to operate they're supposed to uphold the Constitution, supposed to follow the laws. It doesn't matter, you know, if they're cheering on genocide or whatever in Gaza. It's that there's clearly human rights abuses being committed with U.S. weapons, and so the law instructs that you must discontinue the weapons transfers. So that's how it should operate, but it's just not operating that way.
Yeah, and it just really appalls me when I see, and I believe it's in the Democratic platform, or it might have been something that was put out on behalf of Kamala Harris recently during the DNC, that, you know, they believe that the United States should serve as an example for global leadership. And in that context, they talked about humanitarian rights and values. And I'm thinking, are they completely ignoring what's been happening in the last year? Obviously, the answer is yes. But I don't know how long they can get away with that, because, you know, being the example is not just an empty cliche. In this case, if our example is to ignore war crimes at this level, who's to say why we would ever have any beef with any dictator or junta or any other autocrat or player in the world that decides to commit war crimes on their own soil or in their neighbor's soil? You know, we won't have the authority. We shouldn't and won't have the authority to say anything about it, because our example has been to ignore war crimes when it's politically convenient for us. And so, like you said, in the near term, we have this devastating conflict on the ground in which I know that more than 40,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children and innocent, have been killed. In the long term, it could be just the demise, the hastened demise of American empire. Because if part of our strength was our model, our democratic liberal model, that's gone now.
Right. And it was always that was always a justification for American empire is because it was more than just, you know, a cynical exploitation of power and power over the powerless. It was that it stood for something.
Right.
And I think one of the key fractures we're seeing now is from the global South. Like Brazil, for example, if you look at discourse coming from them, I think that's where you'll see the most you'll see the most eye rolling, and you'll see the most consequences. Like South Africa, of course, brought the case before the ICC. Brazil, as I mentioned, has been quick to call it the hypocrisy between U.S. statements on atrocities committed in Gaza versus in Ukraine. Yeah, I think that's where you'll see the most fractures, and it'll be the most difficult to keep those countries in line, so to speak. Especially when it comes to, you know, boycotting Russian goods, for example. I think they'll just say, well, of course, I mean, the person lecturing me on this is a violent hypocrite. So if Russian oil or Russian vodka is cheaper and of higher quality than I would get elsewhere, then I'm just going to do it because it doesn't mean anything.
Wow.
So I think that's one of the things we'll start to see. And I think the most exciting stuff politically when it comes to international politics is coming from the global South anyway. And it hasn't been that way for a while, but I think now there's more unity and more open resistance to American hypocrisy. And the thing is, like, if the Trump administration was doing this, it would still be as brutal, but it wouldn't be as annoying because they wouldn't give us human rights lectures every day as they were doing it. And it's not like I'm hoping for a Trump presidency or whatever. It's just, what Democrats are doing because they preach these higher values. It's almost worse in the sense that they're violating the own things they say. And again, there's an annoyance factor. Like, truly, it's to me, it's just incredibly grating. So that could be a smaller issue, though.
Yeah. Well, listen, I am just so happy to talk about this and to get your story out there. Please continue doing all of this great work. I feel like at the very least, what we can do is show people what's happening with facts and data and pictures. Let them decide and let them get as agitated as we are about this, because at a certain point, there has to be a critical mass of anger on the part of the American people, because you're right. This is only going to turn when politically somebody stands up and says, it calls a war crime for what it is, and then engages the levers of the American legal system to stop it. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. You were a huge help with the article, as well as your teammates at Quincy Institute. So I'm grateful for your help. I'm grateful for you publishing it as well. I just got a lot of eyes on it as a result.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll see you again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kelly.